If you are a Westerner, maybe you hear of an Iranian Ayatollah and think, ooh, bad. Maybe we really should be thinking, this is what happens when we impose our values on other cultures and religions. I am Doris Smith, an independent journalist and host of The Journalism of Everything. Ruhollah Khomeini, birth name Ruhollah Mousavi, was the number one leader of the Iranian Revolution between 1978 and 1979, the one that took Iran from being an ally to an enemy to the United States. Khomeini eventually became an Ayatollah and supreme leader of Iran, but he came from humble but also deeply conservative religious beginnings. He was born in Khomeini, Iran, which is about 200 miles southwest of Tehran. Khomeini was born on September 24th, 1902. His father was Mustafa Mousavi, a respected religious scholar and whose lineage was considered to be from the Prophet Muhammad. So basically a baller when it comes to Shiite Islam traditions. When Khomeini was only 5 months old, his father was killed by local authorities or possible landowners. The details aren't exactly clear. He was raised by his mother and his aunt. Khomeini was raised in conservative Islamic schools from a very early age, focusing on memorizing the Quran, learning Islamic theology, and studying classical Persian literature. He was immersed in both the Muslim and Iranian culture, and it was very important to him. When he was 16, both his mother and his aunt died within a short period of time of each other, and Khomeini went to become even more of a scholar of Islam. Khomeini left Khomeini to study at Iraq Seminary in 1920. Actually, it was a seminary in Iraq. And that's not Iraq, it's Iraq in Iran. What is key about this is that he studied and eventually followed Abdul Karim Hari Yazdi, who became the intellectual center for the revolution. Khomeini followed Yazdi to Qom, which became the place to learn Islamic law and philosophy in Iran. Khomeini was known more as an intellectual than a political activist in his younger years. In 1929, he married Khadija Saqafi. They had 7 children, though sadly 2 died in childhood. So, let's get to the good stuff. How did Khomeini go from quiet cleric to radical revolutionary? Essentially, Shah Pahlavi's modernization of Iran and his cozying up to the West radicalized Khomeini. Remember that when Mohammad Reza Pahlavi came into power, he began to split up the land, which ousted many of the parcels of land held by religious institutions. And at that time, land was power and money. Pahlavi also expanded the Iranian secular education within Iran, and then he gave women voting rights. All of this added up to an attack on Islam, according to Khomeini and a lot of conservative Islamic clerics. Khomeini saw these reforms as a way to remove Islam, the very fabric of Iranian society, from Iran as a whole. Pahlavi was too secular, and Khomeini's radicalization began with this. Khomeini was also vehemently against the Western interests dominating Iranian politics. And there was a lot of that after World War II. He believed that Iran was just a tool for the West. And there is a lot of credence to that. After World War II, Iran was known to be a constitutional monarchy, similar to what the UK is. The Shah was considered to be head of state, but the prime minister and parliament were the true governors of Iran. In 1951, Iranian citizens elected Mohammad Mossadegh, whose main goal was that Iran should control its own oil. At the time, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, or AIOC, which later became British Petroleum, or BP, actually controlled Iran's oil. Britain controlled oil production and profits, and Iran only received a very small share of the revenue for their own oil. In 1951, Mossadegh actually nationalized Iran's oil industry, kicking out Britain. Of course, this hurt Britain a lot. So Britain organized a global boycott on Iranian oil and froze all of their assets, resulting in a massive economic crisis throughout Iran. Britain also wanted to overthrow Mossadegh, but didn't have the power to do that. Who did Britain turn to overthrow Mossadegh? The United States of Interference, of course. By 1953, the Cold War was in full swing, and the U.S. feared that if Iran collapsed economically, the Soviet Union would gain influence in a very strategic area. Under the Eisenhower administration, the CIA and British intelligence staged a coup called Operation Ajax. The CIA and MI6 launched a multi-layered campaign that included propaganda against Mossadegh, deeming him anti-Islamic, a communist, and corrupt. They bribed Iranian politicians, military officers, newspaper editors, and even street organizers against him. They even hired protesters to create chaos in Tehran. In August of 1953, with the help of the Shah, the coup began, but it initially failed. The Shah even fled the country. He tended to do that when things went wrong. On August 19th, though, with the persistence of the CIA, as well as large street protests and the support of the Iranian military, Mossadegh's government collapsed, and the pro-Western puppet Shah Pahlavi returned to Iran. General Fazlollah Zahidi became the prime minister and gave the monarchy much more power. As a result of the coup, Western oil companies regained access to Iranian oil, especially American companies such as Standard Oil of New Jersey, which later became Exxon, Gulf Oil, Texaco, Standard Oil of California, which later became Chevron, and the Saucony Vacuum Oil Company, which later became Mobil. Iran did receive a greater share of the revenue with more American control, but still could not completely control its own oil reserves. What this coup signaled to Iranians especially was that Western nations really were not about promoting democracy, like they said during the Cold War, but really were about their own interests, and if it meant installing an authoritarian government so that the West, Americans especially, could control that authoritarian, then they would do that. It wasn't about democracy. It was about Western interests. That is what Iranians learned. A second event that radicalized Khomeini was a law passed in 1964 that granted legal immunity to American military personnel stationed in Iran. Americans could not be prosecuted in Iranian courts. As a protest against this law and a way to rally Iranians, Khomeini conducted a fiery speech condemning the act. He stated that Iran is now a colony of the United States and that, quote, they have sold the independence of our country, end quote. The most quoted moment of his speech was this, quote, if an American servant or cook murders your religious leader in the middle of the bazaar, the Iranian courts will have no right to try him, end quote. What Khomeini was really trying to drive home was that the lowest member of the household, if they were an American, could literally murder your cleric in broad daylight, in public, and go free. That Iran had given up all of their power to the West. Think about this. Many Americans today are upset that there are undocumented immigrants in this country taking our country's resources while they are breaking the law. Many Iranians felt the same way about this law, that Americans could be in their country and break the worst laws without consequence because their government was bought and paid for by the United States. In order to rally Iran's religious establishment, Khomeini harnessed Islamic doctrine, saying, quote, God will never allow unbelievers to have authority over believers. Though the law really didn't give immunity to American soldiers, it touched on a nerve that already was there from previous foreign interference in Iran. The agreement was that American soldiers would be tried by their own government in U.S. court-martials, but it was a launching point for Khomeini to rally his supporters. In this speech, Khomeini was appealing to a large swath of the Iranian population, especially those dissatisfied with foreign influence within the country. Of course, many points of this speech were against the Shah. So Khomeini was exiled in October 1964, only days after the speech. Khomeini first went to Turkey, then Iraq, and then later, at the end of his exile, France. He was exiled for 15 years and became even more radicalized while away. While Khomeini was exiled, he developed a doctrine that is the core of the Iranian government today, called Velayat-e Faqih. The phrase in Persian translates to Guardianship of the Islamic Jurist. Khomeini's idea was that Islam is a complete system that governs all aspects of life, but Islamic law cannot be properly applied without any political authority. As a result, Islamic scholars, not politicians, should govern the state. As an American, you might mistakenly believe that Islam has always had this belief, but that would be inaccurate. It was Khomeini who came up with this idea, in that the Islamic cleric should also govern Islamic countries. In fact, before Khomeini, Shiite clerics did not believe that they should have political power, but instead should just be informed advisors. They called this quietism, that the imams are the legitimate leaders of society but do not govern politically. Enter Khomeini, who came in saying that the supreme leader of Iran would not only be the religious leader, but would also command the military, appoint key judges, oversee intelligence, influence foreign policy, and even approve or disapprove of political candidates. The clerics would transform from quiet advisors to the most powerful figures in Iran. While Khomeini was exiled, he gained influence in Iran in many creative ways. One of the most powerful and subversive methods he used is that he would record sermons criticizing the Shah on cassette tapes and then would have them smuggled into Iran to be played in mosques, bazaars, and homes. He did this over and over for 15 years, quietly, under the nose of Shah Pahlavi. Right before the Iranian Revolution from 1978 to 1979, Khomeini came out of the shadows while he lived in Paris. France allowed him unrestricted media access where he could give daily press conferences that were broadcast worldwide. People in Iran were ripe for a revolution. The economy was in ruins, and workers in key industries, including oil workers, factory workers, government employees, journalists, teachers, had been on strike for months. The oil industry was nearly shut down, and the government was completely dysfunctional because they didn't have any money. The Shah fled the country on January 16th, 1979, and though he said he was leaving for a vacation, people knew he was not coming back. There was a transitional government in place led by Prime Minister Shapur Bakhtiar, but he was weak and not trusted throughout the country. People throughout Iran were protesting, and they demanded that the monarchy end and that Khomeini return from his exile. So he did. On February 1st, 1979, Khomeini flew into Tehran after being exiled for 15 years. I'll continue the episode next time with the 1979 Iranian Revolution and what it has to do with what is going on in Iran now in 2026.